Hello, everybody. We're going to talk today about censorship. I think it's really important for us to consider exactly what what is involved with censorship as reading teachers. The issue with censorship is that we generally have a lot of different input from various people in the community around us. That's our school community, our um, uh, community that we live in, the nation itself, that sort of dictates to us or tries to dictate to us some things related to censorship. So we're going to think about that issue today. So the first thing I want to do is look at a list of frequently challenged children's books. So if you'll click on the link here, it will bring up, hopefully, a list of challenged children's books. And while we're doing this, let's think about the fact that there are challenged books and there are censored books. Now, this list comes from the American Library Association, which is a really good place to go and look for information about books and freedoms and that sort of thing, as you see over here in the left-hand column. And over here we have books that have been challenged frequently in the last little while. These are not all of these have been banned, but they have been challenged. And we're going to talk about what the difference is between that as we go on. But you can look through this list and you might see titles that are familiar to you. We've got Little Black Sambo, which was a book from way back. You may not even be aware of that book. That was more a book in my childhood. We have a more modern book, Attack of the Mutant Underwear. We have one that's from a little ways back, but is getting a lot of press lately. Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, because they are beginning to film a movie about this book, which is interesting. And as you go on, you will see things like Mommy Laid an Egg, Asking About Sex and Growing Up, The Chocolate Wars, My Brother Sam is Dead is a Collier book that you might have read in high school. You've also got The Watsons Go to Birmingham, which many people are familiar with, James and the Giant Peach, The Slave Dancer, Dr. Seuss. I have to laugh. Two of Dr. Seuss's books made the challenged list, Hop on Pop and If I Ran the Zoo, which we're going to talk about both of those later. So anyway, you go on and on and on and on, and I think there's over 100 titles here for you to look at and think about as we go. So let's think about the difference between a banned book and a challenged book. Before a book can be banned, a book has to be challenged. And what that means is that somebody has taken a feeling against a particular book for whatever reason. They have filed appropriate paperwork with the county to challenge a book, and the book has gone through a review. A banned book then can happen if that review committee decides to ban the book. So that's the difference between the two. So obviously you don't have a partner. So think about this for yourself. What do you think would be a good working assumption about censorship in the classroom? I want you to think about what gets censored, why it gets censored, who does the censoring, who responds to or doesn't respond to the censorship, our political climate, right now, the trade books that are available to American students today. And I want you to think about that for a few minutes and kind of come up with what you think would be a good definition of censorship for the classroom. So put your PowerPoint on pause, think a little bit, and then we're going to continue. Okay, you've had a little bit of time to think about your definition of what censorship is, and I wanted to give you a definition that is a common definition for censorship. So Galda says that censorship is the attempt to deny others the right to read something the censor thinks is offensive. She chooses, or they choose, Galda and her colleagues choose to use the word selection instead. And they say that selection is the process of choosing appropriate materials for readers according to literary and educational judgments. And that may have figured into your thoughts about censorship. I've had people who have said, censorship is denying others the right to read something that is inappropriate for them because of developmental or age issues. For instance, if the book had very mature themes, you might not want to hand it to a second grader or a third grader or a fifth grader, for instance. Selection, on the other hand, sort of incorporates that idea, at least by this definition. It incorporates the idea that we want to choose appropriate materials for readers. But there can be a problem with that. One of the problems could be who decides what's appropriate for what people. Personally, myself, my parents never tried to censor anything I read. I'm sure that I read things that were developmentally not necessarily appropriate for me at that time, but I read them anyway, and nothing, I'm not warped in any way that I know of. But there are people who hold very firmly that we need to make sure that we have some guidelines for selecting literature that we put in our classroom. And so we have to consider who makes that decision, who says what's developmentally appropriate for children. So we have to think about that as we go through this. So here's a statement by the National Council of Teachers of English, NCTE, which is our governing body if we are language arts teachers. And they have adopted this idea of censorship and selection as well. So they say that, first of all, censorship excludes specific materials, but selection includes specific materials. So I guess in a way what they're saying is that if we are making those judgments about what is developmentally appropriate, we are including a body of work or a body of literature that we feel is appropriate for our children to read in our classrooms, our students to read in our classrooms, rather than censoring things. I think some of it is semantics related to this. To me, that's the same process. But this is what they say. Censorship is negative, but selection is affirmative. So censorship, we're saying, boo hiss, we don't like this book. We're going to get rid of it. We're not going to allow it in the classroom. Selection says, look at all these books that we're going to allow in the classroom. And so there are plenty of books there that we're allowing. Censorship intends to control the reading of others. Selection intends to advise the reading of others. Again, to me, it seems almost semantics there, but we'll continue. Censorship seeks to indoctrinate and limit access to ideas and information. Selection seeks to educate and increase access to ideas and information. And then the final point, censorship looks at specific aspects and parts of a work in isolation, and selection examines the relationship of parts to each other and to the work as a whole. Now, I do agree with this last one. When people challenge a book and possibly that book ends up banned, the reason is because that book has been put through censorship. And sometimes the people who are doing the challenging look at only a part of a work in isolation. They may not even have read the book, the whole book, but they see something on a page, maybe a word that they don't consider as an appropriate word on the page, and they decide, oh no, this book has to be banned. And so they, go through the process of challenging the book. Selection, on the other hand, would look at that book and say, okay, what's the reason? Why did the author use that word in there? And we might argue that the author didn't have to use a word. Let's say we're talking about a four-letter word. Maybe we might say that the author didn't need to use the word hell, for instance, in a book that's designed for students to read. And that's true. Maybe the author didn't, but we have to consider, why did the author choose to use that word? Was it just something gratuitous, or was there a reason? Did it lend to our understanding of the character and the emotions that the character is feeling at a particular time in the story? So we have to think about those things. Here's a graphic that has some interesting statistics on it. So and this graphic is for, I'm trying to remember what year this is. This graphic is for 2018. So this was 2 years ago. There were 531 materials that were affected in censorship attempts in the United States in 2018, and that included magazines, books, films, databases, all kinds of things. So notice they made two sort of definitions: the challenge definition that we had before, and then the ban definition that we had before. So notice the pie graph there in the left-hand corner. Who initiates challenges? When we're thinking about challenges for books and censorship for books, the challenges can come from anybody. So you'll notice in 2018 that of these 531 works that were censored, 32% of them were challenged by parents. We have 13% that were challenged by a school board or school administration. So that would be principals or other vice principals, those kinds of things. 10% were challenged by librarians and teachers. 6% were challenged by political and religious groups within the community. 3% were challenged by elected officials within the community. 3% were challenged by students themselves, and 33% were challenged by patrons of a library, which in general, that's usually the public library. So 33% were patrons of a library that didn't fall into any of the other categories. So there's a lot, as you see, a lot of different people who can do the challenging of books. There's a graphic there that describes where challenges take place, which kind of goes with the pie graph itself too. And then there is a Wordle that talks about the reasons for book challenges. And remember that when you make a Wordle, you put in various pieces of writing, and the Wordle software pulls out the ones that the most commonly referred to phrases. So you'll notice some of these that are in bigger print here. You've got political viewpoints were reasons for book challenges. LGBTQIA kinds of issues was probably the biggest instance of challenges, because you'll notice that's the bigger word in this Wordle. You've got gender nonconformity there. You've got sexually explicit topics there, with some of them broken out, nudity and those kinds of things. Drugs, you see all of them there. And there are a lot of different reasons that people challenge books. And so then we get down to the 5 types of book censorship. So you've got the ways that people censor books themselves. So for one instance, vandalizing pages in the book. You will have people who will go into a public library or a school library, check out a book. If they see something on a page that they don't like, let's go back to our example of a 4-letter word, they'll just tear the page out. And they put the book back on the shelf. And so the next person that reads that book misses what was on the front and the back of that page that word was found on. And if they're looking for multiple pages in the book where there may be multiple words that they don't like, then that book is pretty well torn up, and probably will be taken off the shelf just because of the vandalism. Another issue is hiding resources. So in a big library, for instance, a public library or even a school library, somebody might take the book and put it in another place on another shelf. And a lot of times the book is in the library, but then the librarian can't find it. And so therefore it's considered a missing book. It really isn't missing, it's there, but it's not filed in its proper place. And so therefore it can't be found. A third thing is requiring parental permission to access certain books. And this can be an effect of our schools, particularly. What happens is sometimes sometimes a librarian will put a book aside, and in order for students to check that book out, they have to have parental permission. It usually is held behind the desk at that point, and nobody gets to check it out unless they have permission from their parents to check it out. Sometimes people remove materials from libraries, so they just check it out and never turn it back in again, which basically is theft if you think about it, and can have your library privileges revoked because of that. But if you didn't check the book out in the first place, if you just simply took it out and were able to get it out past the censors that they have at the doors, then you are okay in that respect. And then the last one is burning books. And this is such an important thing that even during World War II, this was one of Hitler's ways of controlling people. He would have mass book burnings where people would show their loyalty to the Nazi Party by bringing books that were written by intellectuals, that were written by professors or other college employees, and burning those books. Sort of as we're going to repudiate what these people are saying. So there's a lot of different ways that we see that people try to sort of serve their own censorship without going through the challenging process. Some of the issues that impact censorship are those that we've heard of over and over again. And here's a list. It's not a full list, but it's a pretty conclusive list, I guess, if you want to look at it that way. We see that books are challenged for lifestyle choices. So we may disagree with something, say, for instance, in the LGBTQIA community, or the community as a whole. And so if the book has something in it about that, we might decide to get rid of the book. We might have people who disagree with a particular lifestyle choice, such as, for instance, witchcraft. There is the Wiccans are witches. They call themselves witches. But if a book is written about Wiccans, we may not want children to read that book because we disagree with that. And so we want to challenge the book because of that. Family configurations. If you think about all the various family configurations that there are, and many people don't agree with anything if it's not that nuclear family that we have had historically, the male and female married couple with children, 2.2 children and a dog and a white picket fence. If they disagree with the configurations that don't fit that, then they may want to take a book out of circulation for their children not to read. Religious beliefs, clearly, if your religious beliefs say that you believe in a particular way and the book has in it issues that are related to feeling a different way religiously, then you might not agree with that. Political beliefs in the same way. Language usage in the same way. Body image is one we don't often think about. But that is a sort of a thing to think about, particularly, for instance, in Judy Blume's book. There's a book called Blubber, and it's about a girl who is an overweight girl, and she has negative body images, and is bullied and harassed because of her body shape and size. So that's another issue that we might see that we might want to remove a book for. And just as an aside, many of Judy Blume's books, because they deal with issues of growing up and body image and the way that we look at ourselves and the way that teenagers think about themselves, many of her books have been challenged. All of them are good, but many of them have been challenged. And then things like drugs, addictions, such as drugs or alcohol, and violence. So if a book deals with, for instance, a murder or a domestic abuse situation or a child abuse situation, it might be pulled from a shelf or might be challenged to be pulled from a shelf by parents who don't want their children reading about those things. So I think what we have to do when we think about censorship is that we have to think about our own thoughts about what we agree or disagree with. Above all, we are, let me put this two ways. Above all, we are able to choose what literature is used in our classrooms. We are able to put things on our bookshelves by choice, by our own choice, and not put other things on bookshelves by our own choice. But on the other side of that, I want you to think about the fact that children need to see themselves in the books that they read. If they don't see themselves in those books, they are not going to want to read the books. So if I am a child in a family and I have two mothers and no father, my parents are single sex, it's a single sex family. If I don't see myself in literature, then I get the sort of subconscious feeling that my life is wrong and that I don't matter and that I'm not worth anything. So we have to think about the issues that come with our children to school in order to be able to decide what we can then put on our shelves. And, I can't tell you, there's no way in this class that I can tell you that you have to believe a certain way. Obviously, you have to decide what you believe. You have to decide where your line in the sand is. You're going to go to this line and you're not going to go past that line. In my classroom, I had lots and lots and lots of books that dealt with lots and lots and lots of topics on my bookshelves. And I did it purposefully because I knew that I knew the kinds of lives that my kids lived and the kinds of lives that maybe they wished that they could live. And so I wanted to make sure that they were always able to find literature that supported the kinds of lives that they lived. So think for yourself a little bit about reasons that it might be appropriate to censor literature for a fifth grader. Take a second and Jot down some of those ideas as you think about it. And then once you've done that, also think about what might be appropriate, for what reasons you might censor literature for a 12th grader, and jot down a few of those. And then I want you to compare your list and circle the ones that are the same reasons for a 5th grader that would be the same readers for a 12th grader. And so I'll wait a second and then we'll come back to this. So go ahead and do that. So now we're going to come back and we're going to think about together these 2 lists that you might make. So for reasons for censoring a 12th grader, maybe you might have put on there a topic of a particular book. You might have put on there the age of the reader. Would we censor a book or challenge a book because maybe we feel it's not appropriate for a 5th grader to read? Maybe it would be okay if the child was older. Maybe it'd be okay if the child was in high school, but not for a 5th grader. So you might have that on your list. You might have topics that you want to avoid in your classroom. So maybe you don't want to have any sort of response in the classroom to domestic abuse or child abuse or political affiliations and political feelings, or any number of things. You might have that on your list for a 5th grader. You might also have those very same things on your list for a 12th grader. I know in the past when I've used this in class with students, they've said, well, certain language might be okay, not necessarily desirable, but okay for a 12th grader to read that I would not want to have a 5th grader read. And generally they're talking about maybe 4-letter words in a book. And so sometimes we might have the same reasons for challenging or censoring literature for a 5th grader that we do for a 12th grader, or we might take into account the maturity of the student and maybe be less likely to challenge or censor a book if it was intended for a high schooler, for instance. And I think there's value to that. I think that the idea of age-appropriate literature may be important. But again, back to what we said at the beginning of this video, who decides what is appropriate, age appropriate for a particular child? Who makes that decision? So when we're thinking about what's appropriate and what's appropriate to have in your classroom, we have to think about community standards, we have to think about educational objectives, and we have to think about the needs of the student. And this kind of goes back to what I said earlier. In some areas, you might see, usually in metropolitan areas, you might see a more loose way of looking at books in the classroom than you would in, say, a rural community in the middle of Georgia or the middle of Habersham County, or White or Stevens or wherever you live, Hall, wherever you live. You also might think about the educational objectives. For instance, if I was teaching health, it would be very appropriate for me to have books on my shelf that dealt with puberty issues and growth issues. Some of the ones that we saw on the list of books that have been censored over the years or challenged over the years. It might be very appropriate for me to have that because that would be a part of my curriculum, but maybe not so much in a language arts class or maybe not so much in a math class, So we have to think about all the topics and the educational objectives in each one of those content areas. And then the needs of the student gets back to what I was talking about earlier about being able to see yourself in the literature that you're reading or the literature that's available for you to read. Um, the needs of the student is important. Um, and I think we have to consider all of that as we go. So, the process of challenging a book works this way. Somebody looks at a book or hears about a book or whatever and makes a decision to challenge that material or that book. There is formal paperwork that has to be filed with the school. The principal at the school has access to the forms that have to be filled out. Let's say it's a parent who's making this challenge, and the parent has to go get the forms, fill the forms out, and turn them back in to the principal. On the forms, it usually asks for who you are, why you want to, what the book is, what the title of the book is, and why you think this book is inappropriate for students to read. And this challenge can be made on books in a teacher's classroom as well as books in the school library. So it could happen in both places. Once that formal paperwork has been filed with the school, the principal sets up a committee to investigate the complaint. And on that committee, you might have the principal, maybe other administrators. You might have a guidance counselor. You generally would have a librarian or media specialist. There might be teachers on that committee. There also might be students if it's if the school is the school a middle school or a high school, you might have students on that committee as well. And so the committee is supposed to read the book and figure out look at the challenge, figure out why the person is challenging the book, and then make their decision. The committee comes back together and then decides what they're going to do. And they can go one of three ways with this. They can restrict the material or the book, which means you would need parental permission to read the book. The book would be placed behind the circulation desk where students don't normally go, and they could not take the book out without permission from their parents. Another decision that the committee may decide to go would be to remove the material or the book from access entirely, which means we're just not going to keep it in the library at all. And the third way might be to allow the material or the book to just remain on the shelf in an unrestricted way so that students can check it out whenever they want to. Sometimes the school doesn't want to make the decision. The principal doesn't want to make the decision. So therefore they pass the decision up the chain to district personnel for them to make the decision. The same process happens. They send the paperwork that's been filed to the district. The district committee is formed. The committee gets a little bigger then, generally, because there are community people who might be invited to be on that committee. They are supposed to read the book and make their judgment, and then the school has to abide by whatever the judgment is. The issue can be that sometimes people on those committees, either at the school level or at the district level, might not read that book. They may just look at a summary of the book. They may look at specific pages that have on them whatever issue the parent or whoever has issued the complaint is complaining about, and then they make their decision. They may not look at it in terms of why did the author put this in this book. So they're not looking at the place of what has been done or said in the book as an integral part of the story. So there's an issue with that. And we can have books that are challenged and decisions have been made, such as these decisions, that remove those books from access to students in whatever way, and they're not able to to fix it. They're not, we can't get it back. Once it's been challenged, it's challenged. Once it's been, challenges are okay. Once it's been banned, then at that point, we can't get those books back on the shelf unless we go through a much bigger process to have them put back on the shelf. So that can be an issue. For instance, in a personal experience that I had with a challenge, I was in charge, I was the literacy coach at my school, and I was in charge of selecting books for our drop everything and read approach that we had in schools. So after lunch, everybody, as part of that, whenever your class ate lunch, as part of that, you were supposed to spend 15 to 20 minutes reading aloud to students from a communal book. So the whole school read the book. So one year, it was about the first year that the Harry Potter books started coming out. And I had noticed that kids were just voraciously loving those books. So I had bought a whole school set of the first Harry Potter book, the Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. And that was going to be our read aloud for a month. The problem with that was that there were 3 or 4 teachers who went to the principal and said, if you make me read this book, I'm going to quit. I'm not going to read this book to students. Unfortunately, 2 of those teachers were on my team, which really surprised me. The principal called me in and said, what's the value of the book? He hadn't read the book. He said, what's the value of this book? I explained to him that it was a book about a fantasy in a child's world, that I felt it had great value because children need to be able to tell the difference between fantasy and reality, and they need to be able to explore with their imagination elements of fantasy. And he made the decision to have me pull the books back. So I pulled them back. We did not read them as a school. However, I spread them out. I sent them out to teachers and said, here, put this on your bookshelf. And they did. I didn't send it to the 3 or 4 teachers who complained, but I sent it to other teachers. They all put it on their bookshelves. So the book was out there for children to read if they chose to read the book. It just wasn't read to them aloud by the teacher. It was not necessarily a challenge in the sense of what we were just talking about, this process of challenging, but it was an effort to censor what children were able to read. And in the case of those 3 of those 4 teachers had not read the book at all. So when I asked them about it, they said, no, I haven't read the book. Their excuse was, my pastor told me this is a bad book, and so therefore I'm not going to put it on my shelf. And I'm not going to read it to students. And, the principal allowed them to do that. So there wasn't much I could say about it. But anyway, this challenge process goes through, and this is how books get taken off the shelf from time to time. So the things that we need to do as teachers, first of all, every year, when the school year begins, your media specialist will get a list of books on which are the titles of the books that have been placed on the challenged or banned book list for your county. So always go to your media specialist and ask your media specialist for that list so that you can check and see what books you have on your shelf that might be on that list. That doesn't mean that you have to take them off your shelf. That just simply means you need to be aware in case those books are challenged by the parents of the children in your class that year. We always need to operate in the sunshine, and by that I mean let your parents know about the books that are on your shelf. Every year in that material that went home at the beginning of the year and in open house, I would say to parents, here's my books. These are the books. This is my room. Come in, look at the books. You can check out any book you would like to read. Please make yourself available to look at the books and any book that you want to look at. I never in 18 years had any parent come into my room to look at the books on my bookshelves. So I don't know if they just trusted me enough or if they didn't care enough to come in and look. I don't know which it was, but that was my way of letting them know what was on my bookshelf. And as I said earlier, I had plenty of books that might be considered controversial books on my bookshelves, but nobody ever challenged me on them. Offering a wide diversity of books for all students. So we want to make sure that we have many different kinds of genres of books, as well as many different kinds of topics for those books. We want kids to find things to read that they're interested in and that they can see themselves in. You need to know the books of your people. You need to know what kids are reading today, and you need to be familiar with those books. Because if, for instance, a book was challenged, you need to be able to offer a suggestion for a different book that might have the same themes in it that a child might be able to read. So you need to know what books are out there. It's not enough to say, oh, my favorite book when I was a kid was The Velveteen Rabbit. Well, yes, it was your favorite book, and yes, it's still the favorite book of many children today. But there are lots of books that have been written since then. So you need to know the books of your people. And how do you get to know those books? Go to the bookstore, go to the library, browse through the books, see what's on the shelves, look online for books, book lists for children, and get to know, at least in general, what those books are about. I mean, I would say read the books yourself, but maybe you're not like me. And so at least get to know the subject of the book and find out, if I hear the title, The Watsons Go to Birmingham, what is that book about? And why is that a good book to have in my classroom? And then finally, decide what issues are important to you and where you want to draw your line in the stand, and then stand up for yourself. Over 18 years, I only had parents challenge me twice on a book that I used instructionally in my classroom. And in both cases, it was To Kill a Mockingbird, which every single one of us probably have read in high school. The thing that surprised me, the first challenge that was made was a parent of an 8th grade student. This girl was a straight A student, loved to read, very quiet, but loved to read. And I was going to teach To Kill a Mockingbird. And at that time, my book novel studies were about a month long. And so I sent the book, checked out the books to the students, sent them home. They were going to read the first chapter for homework. And the father called me and said, I want to talk to you. And I said, okay, come on in. And so he came in and he said, I don't want my child reading this book. And I said, why not? And he said, and I have to apologize for the language, he said, I don't want my child reading a book about niggers. And I said, I kind of gulped. And I said, okay, and this was within my first, I think it was my 4th year of teaching, might have been my 3rd year of teaching. And I had never had this situation before. So I had never planned to be proactive about it. Because I didn't really believe it would ever happen. And so I said, okay. I said, I'll let her read something else. And he said, okay. He said, so I got to thinking about it. I said, now you realize that I'm going to be teaching this book to a classroom full of students, and I'm going to have to send your child to the library while I'm teaching this book. And it's going to take about a month. And he said, I don't care. I don't want her reading it. And I said, okay. So I probably would handle things differently now. In fact, I definitely would handle things differently now. But at that time, I sent the girl to the library and I said, for the next month, you're going to be in the library during this period. Pick out a book and read whatever you want to read, and I'll give you an A at the end of the semester. I wouldn't do that necessarily now. That's not really good practice. But at the time, I thought she would have made an A in my class anyhow, because she was that kind of student, already proved to be that kind of student. The second time that book was challenged was I was teaching it to a 7th grade group. A mother called me and said, I'm a little concerned about my daughter reading To Kill a Mockingbird. And I said, why? And she said, because of the incest in the book. And so I'm thinking, what incest? And I'm running back through the book and trying to think of how there could be any incest in that book. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, Mayella and her father were in an incestuous relationship in that book. And I thought, oh, I said, hold up a minute. I said, where did you come up with that? And she said, well, I took this course in college, and the professor had us read To Kill a Mockingbird, and we talked about the incestuous relationship between Mayella and her husband and her father. And so then I said, well, okay. I said, number one, I would never talk about incest with seventh graders, most likely, unless it happened to be initiated by a student. Secondly, that's not in the book. I said you may interpret the book in that way. That's probably what happened with that college professor. But I said, there's nothing that is overtly in there that talks about incest of any sort. And so the mother said, huh. And I said, sometimes when we take college courses, because I have a degree in literature, sometimes when we take college courses, the college professors can come up with some kind of strange stuff, And she agreed with me. And she said, maybe I'll read it with her. And I said, I think that'd be a marvelous idea. I said, you two sit down, read it together, and talk about it at home, and we'll talk about it in school. And I said, she'll have a good understanding of the characters and the themes and the story because of that. And the mother said, okay, I'm okay with it. Then she can read the book. And I thought that was a much better way to handle it than the way I handled it with the first challenge to that. But the important thing is to know, to decide, as I said, what issues are important to you, and then stick to your guns over that issue, whatever decision you've made. I can't tell you that as a new teacher, it's a good idea for you to go out and rock the boat and just stand up and say, no, I'm going to have this in my classroom. But again, you need to have a reason for having it in your classroom. And parents or anyone else can't argue successfully against you if you say that there's educational value in a book and you can back it up. So that's the important thing to remember about issues of censorship. So one of the books that is it actually is the most challenged children's book is the book And Tango Makes Three. And so I've included a link here for you so that you can go out and look at the book, listen to the book. This is somebody reading it on YouTube. You can read the book or listen as the book is read, and make your own decision about this. The book has been challenged over and over and over again, and it's generally challenged because it's generally challenged by people who disagree with alternative lifestyles. So I want you to go out, read the book, think about it, and then think about what you would do. This book would be appropriate to have on a bookshelf really up through probably middle grades. You could use it instructionally in your classroom, maybe even in high school instructionally in your classroom, if you were talking about relationships, if you were talking about animals and how the habitats and the ways that animals behave, those kinds of things. So do take the chance, read the book, and then decide where you would stand in all of this. And that concludes our PowerPoint for this week. Thanks for listening.